A golden retriever has been lying beside a child's grave for 3 weeks, refusing food and ignoring the cold rain that soaks his fur. The sight breaks hearts throughout Cedar Falls as Scout maintains his faithful vigil over 8-year-old Tommy Matthews, a boy who died with no family left to mourn him. Most people think the dog will eventually give up and move on. They're wrong. Scout isn't just grieving, he's protecting something. Tech millionaire Luke Harlan returns to his hometown for a business deal and becomes captivated by the loyal dog's devotion. Luke understands loss and knows that some graves hold more than memories. His own brother is buried in that same cemetery, a painful chapter he spent years trying to forget. When Scout suddenly starts digging at the grave in the middle of the night, Luke realizes this isn't about grief. It's about secrets someone wanted to stay buried forever. What could a lonely 8-year-old boy have hidden that's worth a dog's endless watch? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Cedar Falls like an old man's memories, reluctant to let go of the night. Luke Harlan pulled his black Tesla into the gravel parking lot of Hillcrest Cemetery, the crunch of stones beneath his tires, the only sound breaking the rural silence. At 46, Luke carried himself with the measured confidence of someone who had built an empire from nothing. But returning to this place after 28 years had stripped away some of that armor. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. The cemetery looked smaller than he remembered, though perhaps that was just the perspective of adulthood. The wrought iron gates still bore the pattern of decades, and the old oak trees had grown thick enough to create a canopy that filtered the early morning light into golden patches on the grass. Luke stepped out of the car, his expensive Italian leather shoes feeling absurd on the uneven ground. He dressed for a business meeting later that morning with the mayor and city council about his development proposal, a luxury resort and conference center that would transform this sleepy town into something profitable. But first, he had to face what he'd come here to avoid for nearly 3 decades. The path to his brother's grave wound through rows of weathered headstones, each one telling its own story of lives lived and lost. Luke remembered walking this same route as an 18-year-old, his parents flanking him in black funeral attire, his mother's quiet sobs the only sound as they laid David to rest. His younger brother had been just 16, taken by a drunk driver on a rainy October night that had forever changed the trajectory of Luke's life. As he rounded the bend near the older section of the cemetery, something unexpected caught his eye. About 50 yards away, near a small, newer grave, a golden retriever lay motionless in the grass. The dog's position was deliberate, head resting on its paws, body stretched protectively alongside a simple granite headstone. Luke paused, studying the scene. Even from this distance, he could see the dog's ribs showing through its coat, the way its eyes never left the grave marker. There was something profoundly moving about the animal's vigil, something that spoke to a loyalty that transcended understanding. He approached slowly, not wanting to disturb what was clearly a sacred moment. As he drew closer, he could read the inscription on the small headstone: Tommy Matthews, 2016 to 2024. Beloved by Scout, 8 years old. The same age Luke had been when he'd first brought his puppy home, a golden retriever named Rusty, who'd lived for 14 years and died the same month Luke had graduated college. He remembered how devastated he'd been, how his parents had struggled to explain that losing someone you love never gets easier, but the love itself makes the pain worthwhile. The dog Scout apparently lifted his head as Luke approached, brown eyes meeting his with an intelligence that was both heartbreaking and profound. The animal's tail didn't wag, but neither did he show fear. Instead, there was a recognition, as if Scout understood that Luke, too, was someone who knew about loss. "Hello, boy," Luke said softly, crouching down several feet away. "I'm sorry about Tommy." Scout's ears perked up at the mention of the name. And for just a moment, his tail moved not a wag, but a slight acknowledgement. Luke could see the dog was severely underweight, his golden coat dulled by weather and neglect. There were food and water bowls nearby, placed by well-meaning townspeople, but they remained largely untouched. Luke had read about this phenomenon, animals grieving so deeply they refuse sustenance. He'd never believed it until now, seeing the evidence with his own eyes. This wasn't just sadness. This was devotion that ran deeper than survival instinct. "You're gonna make yourself sick, you know," Luke continued, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd once used with his own pets. Tommy wouldn't want that. At this, Scout's head tilted slightly, and Luke felt something crack open in his chest, a place he'd kept carefully sealed for decades. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a protein bar from his morning run, unwrapping it slowly. Scout watched but didn't move as Luke broke off a piece and placed it on the ground between them. "I had a brother once," Luke found himself saying, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "He died when I was 18. I thought I knew everything about grief back then, but I was just a kid playing at understanding loss." Scout's eyes never left his face, and Luke felt the strange sensation of being truly heard, perhaps for the first time in years. His therapist in San Francisco had told him about the importance of processing grief, but somehow it felt different here, with this dog who understood loyalty in a way that most humans had forgotten. A car door slammed in the distance, and Luke looked up to see an elderly woman walking toward them, carrying a fresh bouquet of flowers. She moved slowly but purposefully, and as she drew closer, Luke could see the lines of genuine concern etched in her face. "You must be the businessman everyone's talking about," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd spent decades making strangers feel welcome. "I'm Martha Hendricks. I live just down the road." Luke stood, brushing grass from his suit pants. "Luke Harlan. I was just visiting my brother's grave and noticed the dog." Martha's expression softened as she looked at Scout. "Breaks your heart, doesn't it? Been coming here every day for 3 weeks, ever since we buried little Tommy. The boy's social worker said there wasn't any family left, just Scout here. They were going to take him to the county shelter, but he kept running away, coming back." "Here, what happened to the boy?" Luke asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Foster care situation that didn't work out well," Martha said, placing the flowers beside Tommy's headstone. Scout's nose twitched at their scent, and for a moment, his tail lifted slightly. "From what I understand, Tommy was in the system most of his life, moved around a lot. The last family he was with weren't equipped to handle a boy who'd been through trauma." Luke felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How did he die?" Martha's face clouded over. "Accident, supposedly. Fell down the stairs in his foster home. The investigators said there was no evidence of foul play, but that boy loved Scout more than anything in this world. Dog never left his side. They'd walk through town together every evening, just before sunset. Tommy would throw sticks, and Scout would fetch them. Simple pleasures, you know?" The image of a lonely boy finding solace in his dog's companionship hit Luke with unexpected force. He thought of his own childhood, how Rusty had been his constant companion through his parents' arguments, through the social awkwardness of being the smart kid in a blue-collar town, through the terrible loneliness that came from feeling different. "The foster parents," Luke said carefully. "Where are they now?" "Moved away right after the funeral. Didn't even stay to see Tommy buried." Martha's voice carried a note of disapproval that spoke volumes. "Left Scout behind, too. Said they couldn't handle a grieving dog on top of everything else." Luke looked down at Scout, who had returned his attention to the grave. The dog's loyalty in the face of abandonment was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Here was love in its purest form, uncomplicated by expectation or self-interest, enduring beyond death itself. "Has anyone tried to help him?" Luke asked. "The dog, I mean." "Oh, plenty of folks have tried. Dr. Peterson, the vet, comes by twice a week to check on him, brings food and water. Several families offered to take him in, but he just runs away and comes back here. It's like he's waiting for something." Or someone, Luke thought, but kept the observation to himself. He reached into his wallet and pulled out several $100s, pressing the bills into Martha's surprised hands. "For food, veterinary care, whatever Scout needs," he said. "I'll be in town for a few weeks, handling some business. I'd like to help." Martha's eyes widened at the amount, but she nodded graciously. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Harlan. Scout here will appreciate it, I'm sure." As Martha walked away, Luke remained standing beside the grave, studying the simple headstone. Something about the boy's story nagged at him, not just the sadness of it, but something else, something he couldn't quite identify. The foster care system, the mysterious accident, the way Scout refused to leave, it all felt too familiar somehow, like a song he'd heard long ago but couldn't quite remember. He pulled out his phone and made a note to himself. Look into Tommy Matthews' case files. As a successful businessman, Luke had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him there was more to this story than a boy's accidental death and a dog's grief. Scout lifted his head and looked directly at Luke, those brown eyes seeming to convey a message Luke couldn't yet decode. But he understood enough to know that he'd been invited into something significant, something that would require him to confront parts of his past he'd spent decades avoiding. "I'll be back tomorrow," Luke promised, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. As he walked back toward his car, he could feel Scout's gaze following him, and for the first time in years, Luke felt the pull of purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly reports. Back in his hotel room that evening, Luke opened his laptop and began his preliminary research. Cedar Falls had a population of just under 3,000 people, and in a town that small, secrets were hard to keep. The local newspaper's website had covered Tommy's death in a brief article that raised more questions than it answered. An 8-year-old boy found dead at the bottom of a staircase, ruled accidental by the county coroner. No surviving family members, ward of the state, beloved only by his dog. But there was something in the sparse details that didn't sit right with Luke. The foster family's immediate departure from town, the lack of any investigation beyond the initial ruling, the way everyone seemed to accept that a careful, traumatized child would suddenly become reckless enough to fall downstairs in the dark. Luke had built his fortune by seeing patterns others missed, by asking questions when everyone else accepted easy answers. His tech company had revolutionized data analysis by finding connections in seemingly random information. Now, as he stared at the few paragraphs about Tommy Matthews' death, he felt that same instinct stirring, the certainty that there was more to this story than anyone wanted to admit. He made another note in his phone. Contact private investigator. Full background check on foster family and circumstances of death. Then he closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet streets of his hometown. Somewhere out there, Scout was keeping his vigil, waiting for something that might never come. But Luke was beginning to suspect that what Scout was waiting for might be him. Luke's meeting with the city council had gone better than expected. The mayor, a pragmatic woman in her 60s named Carol Jang, understood the economic benefits his development would bring to Cedar Falls. The resort would create jobs, draw tourism, and revitalize a town that had been slowly dying since the lumber mill closed 10 years earlier. But as Luke sat in his hotel room that evening, reviewing the environmental impact reports and zoning documents, he found his thoughts drifting back to Scout and the small grave in Hillcrest Cemetery. He'd called Dr. Peterson, the veterinarian Martha had mentioned and learn more about Tommy's final weeks. That boy and his dog were inseparable. Dr. Peterson had told him over the phone. Scout's a purebred golden, probably worth a fair amount, but Tommy treated him like family. Brought him in for every vaccination, every checkup. Kid didn't have much, but he made sure Scout had everything he needed. The veterinarian's voice had carried a note of sadness that suggested there was more to the story. The foster family never brought Scout in once during the 3 months Tommy lived with them. Said it was too expensive, that they were already doing enough taking care of the boy. Luke had pressed for more details about the accident, but Dr. Peterson had grown evasive. Not my place to speculate, he'd said finally. But I will say this: Tommy was a careful child. Old before his time, you know? Had to be, given what he'd been through. Now, as Luke stared out his hotel window at the quiet main street of Cedar Falls, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. He opened his laptop and began searching for information about Tommy Matthews, using the investigative resources his company employed for due diligence on business deals. What he found made his blood run cold. Tommy had been placed in 17 different foster homes over 6 years. The file, accessed through connections Luke preferred not to examine too closely, painted a picture of a system failing a vulnerable child repeatedly. Some placements lasted only weeks, others several months, but the pattern was consistent. Tommy was described as withdrawn, difficult to bond with, and overly attached to his dog. The final placement with Dale and Jennifer Morrison had lasted 3 months. The incident report from the county sheriff's department was clinical in its brevity. 8-year-old male found at bottom of stairs. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. Ruled accidental. The Morrisons had reported that Tommy had gotten up during the night to let his dog out and apparently fallen down the steep wooden stairs in the dark. But there were discrepancies that bothered Luke. The medical examiner's report, which he accessed through channels that weren't entirely legal, but were certainly effective, noted that the pattern of injuries was consistent with but not conclusive of accidental fall. There were bruises on Tommy's upper arms that predated the fatal injuries by several days, and Scout had been found locked in a closet when the paramedics arrived. Odd behavior for a dog that had supposedly been let outside. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the final documents. The Morrisons had moved out of state within a week of the funeral, claiming they needed a fresh start after the traumatic experience. They'd left no forwarding address and had never responded to follow-up inquiries from social services. The more Luke read, the more convinced he became that Tommy's death hadn't been an accident. But what haunted him even more was a detail buried in the initial social services report from when Tommy had first entered the system. The boy had been found abandoned at a bus station in Portland when he was 2 years old, with only a note pinned to his jacket that read, "His name is Thomas. Please take care of him." Luke stared at that detail for a long time, a memory stirring in the depths of his mind. 2 years old, abandoned. The timing would have been 2018, just 2 years after his brother David had died. Luke remembered his parents' devastating grief, how they'd barely been able to function for months after losing their younger son. His mother had mentioned something once, during one of their rare phone calls before her death, about David having been seeing a girl before the accident. Someone from out of town, someone she'd never met. Luke had dismissed it as his mother's tendency to romanticize David's memory. But now he reached for his phone and called his parents' old lawyer, a man named Harold Westbrook, who'd handled their estate. It was late, but Harold had always been a night owl, and sure enough, he answered on the 3rd ring. "Luke? Good Lord, it's been years. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Harold. Listen, I need to ask you something about my brother David. Before he died, was there ever mention of a girlfriend? Someone he might have been serious about?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Why do you ask?" "It's complicated." "Please, Harold. This is important." Harold sighed. "Your parents never wanted you to know because they thought it would only cause more pain." But yes, David had been dating a girl from Portland for about 6 months before the accident. Sarah something Martinez, I think. Your mother tried to reach her after David's funeral, wanted to invite her to the service, but the girl had disappeared, left town suddenly, according to her roommates. Luke's throat felt dry. Did they ever find out why she left? Not that I know of. Your mother always suspected the girl might have been pregnant, but she never had any proof. It was just maternal instinct, I suppose. She said Sarah had looked scared at David's funeral, not just sad, but genuinely frightened. The pieces began falling into place with terrible clarity. If Sarah Martinez had been pregnant with David's child, if she'd given birth in 2016 and struggled as a single mother for 2 years before abandoning the boy at a bus. Station Luke's hands shook as he pulled up the photo from Tommy's social services file. The boy had been thin, with light brown hair and large eyes that seemed older than his years. But it was the small birthmark visible on his left temple that made Luke's breath catch in his throat. He'd seen that same birthmark every day for 16 years on his brother David's face. The room seemed to tilt around him as the implications sank in. Tommy Matthews hadn't been just another tragic case of a failed system. He'd been Luke's nephew, David's son, abandoned and forgotten, shuffled through a system that had ultimately failed to protect him from the very people who should have kept him safe. And Scout, loyal Scout, had been keeping vigil over the grave of a boy who belonged to Luke's family, a boy who died alone and unloved because Luke had never known he existed. Luke stumbled to the bathroom and vomited, his body rejecting the terrible knowledge that he could have prevented this tragedy if he'd only known. Tommy had been blood, family, the nephew Luke never knew he had. While Luke had been building his empire and running from his grief, his brother's child had been suffering in silence, moving from home to home with only a golden retriever for companionship. When he finally composed himself enough to return to his laptop, Luke began making a list of everything he needed to do. He would hire private investigators to track down the Morrisons. He would uncover every detail of Tommy's short life and make sure someone paid for what had been done to him. He would find out why Sarah Martinez had abandoned her child and whether she was even still alive. But first, he had to go back to the cemetery. He had to tell Scout that he understood now why the dog wouldn't leave Tommy's grave. Scout had been protecting the last member of the Harlan family, waiting for someone to come looking, someone who would recognize that this wasn't just another forgotten child. As Luke grabbed his car keys and headed for the door, he made a silent promise to both Tommy and Scout. He would make this right, no matter what it cost him. The boy deserved justice, and Scout deserved to know that his vigil was finally over. The truth had been buried for 8 years, but Luke Harlan had built his fortune by digging up things others preferred to keep hidden. This time, it wasn't about profit. It was about family and redemption, and making sure a little boy's death meant something more than just another tragic statistic. At the cemetery, Scout lifted his head as Luke approached in the darkness, those intelligent brown eyes reflecting the beam of Luke's flashlight. The dog didn't seem surprised to see him, as if he'd been expecting this midnight visit. "I know who you've been waiting for," Luke said quietly, settling onto the damp grass beside Tommy's grave. "I know Tommy was my nephew, my brother's son. I'm so sorry it took me this long to find him." Scout moved closer, allowing Luke to wrap his arms around the dog's thin frame. For the first time in 3 weeks, Scout's tail wagged not with joy, exactly, but with something that might have been relief. His vigil was no longer solitary. Family had finally come to claim what was theirs. As Luke sat there in the darkness, holding his nephew's dog and staring at the simple headstone that marked the grave of a boy he'd never known but already loved. He felt something shift inside him. The careful walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, but instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of purpose. Tommy Matthews had died alone and forgotten, but he wouldn't stay that way. Luke would make sure the world knew this boy's story, would ensure that his death meant something. And he would start by bringing justice to the people who had stolen a child's life and thought they could simply walk away. The investigation began tomorrow. Tonight, Luke would keep vigil with Scout, two grievers finding solace in shared purpose and the promise of justice for a boy who deserves so much more than the brief, painful life he'd been given. The next morning, Luke canceled his remaining business meetings and made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Rebecca Torres, one of the most respected private investigators on the West Coast, whose firm specialized in cold cases and missing persons. The second was to Michael Chun, a criminal defense attorney whose reputation for taking unchallenging cases was matched only by his success rate. "I need you to find 2 people," Luke told Rebecca during their video call. Dale and Jennifer Morrison, who left Cedar Falls about 8 months ago after a child in their care died. "I have reason to believe they're responsible for his death." Rebecca, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, took notes as Luke explained the situation. "You understand that if this was ruled an accident by local authorities, reopening the investigation won't be simple." "I'm not interested in simple," Luke replied. "I'm interested in the truth. Money is no object. I'll need everything you have on the case, plus authorization to access financial records, travel documents, and employment history." Rebecca's voice was matter-of-fact. "If they're hiding, I'll find them. But Mr. Harlan, I have to ask, what's your personal connection to this boy?" Luke felt his throat tighten. "He was my nephew. I just found out yesterday." Rebecca's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'll get started immediately." After ending the call, Luke drove to Portland, following the trail of Sarah Martinez, the young woman who had given birth to David's child and then abandoned him at a bus station when he was barely 2 years old. Her last known address was a rundown apartment complex near the industrial district, the kind of place where people went when they were running from something or trying to disappear. The current manager, a weathered man named Frank, who looked like he'd seen everything life could throw at him, remembered Sarah clearly. Pretty girl, real quiet, kept to herself mostly. Had a little boy with her for a while, cute kid with big eyes. "What happened to her?" Luke asked, slipping Frank a $20 bill. "Drugs," Frank said simply. "Started using heavy around the time the kid disappeared. Some folks said she'd given him away. Others thought maybe child services took him. She got evicted about 6 months later, owed 3 months' rent." Luke felt sick. While he'd been building his tech empire, oblivious to his nephew's existence, Tommy's mother had been spiraling into addiction, unable to care for the child she'd brought into the world. "Do you know where she went?" "Heard she was living on the streets for a while. Then someone said she'd gone into rehab. But that was years ago. Could be anywhere now, if she's even still alive." Luke thanked Frank and spent the rest of the day tracking down Sarah's former roommates and co-workers. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking. A young woman struggling with grief over David's death, overwhelmed by single motherhood, and gradually losing her battle with depression and substance abuse. She really loved that little boy, said Maria Santos, who had worked with Sarah at a diner. But she was barely 18 when he was born, and she had no family support. The father had died in a car accident before Tommy was even born. She tried to do right by him, but she was drowning. "Why didn't she contact David's family?" Luke asked. Maria shrugged. "She was scared, I think. Said the boy's father came from a different world, that his family wouldn't want anything to do with her or the baby. She convinced herself it was better to handle things on her own." The tragic irony wasn't lost on Luke. While Sarah had been struggling alone, believing David's family would reject her, his parents had been desperate for any connection to their lost son. They would have welcomed both Sarah and Tommy with open arms, would have provided all the support and love both of them needed. But Sarah's fear and Luke's own emotional distance had created a perfect storm of isolation that ultimately cost Tommy his life. That evening, Luke returned to the cemetery to find Scout in his usual position beside Tommy's grave. But the dog looked up expectantly when Luke's car pulled into the parking lot. Dr. Peterson had been by earlier with fresh food and water, and for the first time since Tommy's death, both bowls were empty. "Good boy," Luke said, settling onto the grass beside Scout. "I'm going to find out what happened to him, I promise." He pulled out his phone and showed Scout a photo he'd found in Tommy's social services file. A picture of the boy grinning widely while Scout, then just a puppy, licked his face. The dog's ears perked up at the sight of the image, and his tail wagged slowly. "You remember him as a little boy, don't you?" Luke said softly. "You were there for all of it. Every foster home, every rejection, every time he got moved to a new family. You were the only constant in his life." Scout moved closer, resting his head on Luke's lap. In that moment, Luke felt the full weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just seeking justice for a stranger. He was fighting for family, for the nephew who should have grown up knowing he was loved, who should have had the chance to learn about his father and grandfather, who should have been raised with the knowledge that he belonged somewhere. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. A woman in her 30s was walking toward them, her movement cautious but determined. She was dressed in jeans and a worn sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Mr. Harlan?" she called softly. "I'm Ana Rodriguez. I was Tommy's social worker." Luke stood, instinctively positioning himself between the stranger and Scout. "Yes? I heard you've been asking questions about his case." Ana stopped several feet away, her eyes moving between Luke and the dog. "I need to talk to you." Luke studied her face, noting the lines of genuine care around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly. "You worked with Tommy?" "For 2 years. I was the one who placed him with the Morrisons." Ana's voice carried a weight of guilt that Luke recognized all too well. "I heard you think there might have been more to his death than what was reported." "I know there was more." Luke's voice was firm. "Tommy was my nephew. My brother David died in 2016, but he left behind a son I never knew existed until yesterday." Ana's face went pale. "Your nephew?" "But the record said there was no family, because nobody knew to look for us. Tommy's mother never told anyone who the father was." Luke gestured toward the grave. "But he had David's birthmark, and the timing fits perfectly. Sarah Martinez disappeared right after my brother's funeral, and Tommy was abandoned 2 years later." Ana sank onto a nearby bench, her composure cracking. "Oh my God. I placed him with 17 different families over 6 years, and he had an uncle the whole time. If I'd just done more research, if I'd tried harder to find blood relatives." "You couldn't have known," Luke said, though the words felt inadequate. "The system failed him, but not because of anything you did or didn't do." "The Morrisons?" Ana said suddenly, looking up at Luke. "There was something off about them from the beginning, but I was desperate to find Tommy a permanent placement. He'd been through so much already, been rejected by so many families who couldn't handle his attachment to Scout." Luke felt his jaw tighten. What was off about them? Ana glanced around, as if checking to make sure they weren't overheard. "They only agreed to take Tommy if he came with the monthly stipend for special needs children. Tommy wasn't officially classified as special needs, but his history of trauma and attachment issues qualified him for additional support funding. They were in it for the money. I suspected, but I couldn't prove it. And Tommy seemed not happy, exactly, but stable. He was going to school, Scout was allowed to stay, and the Morrisons reported that he was adjusting well. Ana's voice grew hollow. I should have done unscheduled visits. I should have trusted my instincts. Luke sat down beside her, his hand finding Scout's head automatically. The dog had finished eating and now lay quietly between them, as if sensing the gravity of their conversation. Tell me about Tommy, Luke said. What was he like? Ana's expression softened, quiet but incredibly bright. He loved to draw, had this amazing talent for capturing people's expressions, their emotions. He'd sketched the other kids in his foster homes, their pets, anything that moved him. She paused, wiping her eyes. He drew Scout constantly. I had a whole notebook filled with pictures of that dog in different poses, different moods. Luke felt something twist in his chest. David had been an artist too, always sketching in the margins of his school notebooks, driving their parents crazy by turning homework assignments into elaborate doodles. Did he ever talk about wanting to find his family? Luke asked. All the time, especially when he was younger. He had this fantasy that his parents were looking for him, that they'd been separated by some terrible mistake and would eventually find him. Ana smiled sadly. I tried to help him understand that sometimes parents aren't able to care for their children, but he never stopped hoping. The injustice of it hit Luke like a physical blow. While Tommy had been dreaming of a family that would love him, Luke had been across the country, building walls around his heart and telling himself that success was the only thing that mattered. If he'd just come home for his parents' funeral instead of arranging everything remotely, if he'd just bothered to maintain connections in Cedar Falls, someone might have mentioned David's girlfriend and the child she'd left behind. The investigation into his death, Luke said, pushing through his guilt to focus on what could still be changed. Were you satisfied with the conclusions? Ana shook her head firmly. Not at all. Tommy was careful, almost obsessively so. He'd been hurt by careless adults too many times to be reckless himself. The idea that he'd go down those stairs in the dark without turning on the light. She trailed off, then looked directly at Luke. And Scout would never have been locked in a closet if Tommy had let him out. That dog followed Tommy everywhere. Tommy wouldn't have shut him away. What do you think really happened? I think the Morrisons lost their temper with Tommy about something, and things escalated beyond what they intended. When they realized how badly he was hurt, they staged the scene to look like an accident. Ana's voice was steady, but her hands clenched into fists. I think they locked Scout in the closet because he tried to protect Tommy. Luke felt a rage building in his chest that was both foreign and familiar. He'd experienced this same burning need for justice when David had died, but then it had been directed at a drunk driver who was already facing legal consequences. Now it was focused on two people who had literally gotten away with murder. The next morning brought a breakthrough. Ana arrived at Luke's hotel with a manila folder containing Tommy's personal belongings, the few items that had been salvaged from the Morrison house before the couple's hasty departure. I've been carrying these around for months, Ana said, her voice thick with emotion. I kept thinking someone from his family would eventually come forward, someone who would want to know about the boy he was. Luke opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were school reports showing Tommy's academic excellence despite his difficult circumstances, a few photographs from various foster placements, and 3 spiral notebooks filled with sketches. The artwork took Luke's breath away, not just because of its quality, but because he could see David's talent living on in his son's hands. Page after page showed Scout in various poses, sleeping curled up in a sunny patch, running through tall grass, sitting alertly beside Tommy's bed. But there were other drawings, 2 sketches of foster families, some rendered with careful attention to kindness in their expressions, others depicting the subtle signs of indifference or cruelty. One drawing, in particular, made Luke's hands shake. It showed a man's figure looming over a small, cowering child, the angles harsh and threatening. In the corner, Tommy had written in careful block letters, "Mar Morrison mad again." "Ana," Luke said quietly, "have you shown these to anyone?" She shook her head. The police didn't seem interested in anything beyond the physical evidence at the scene. They said drawings weren't proof of anything. The kids often exaggerate conflicts with authority figures. Luke photographed every page with his phone, then called Rebecca Torres. "I'm sending you something that changes everything," he said when she answered. Tommy documented what was happening to him. "We have evidence." 2 days later, Rebecca's initial report arrived via encrypted email. The Morrisons had indeed disappeared immediately after Tommy's death, but they'd left a trail. Credit card charges showed they'd driven straight through to Las Vegas, where they'd used fake IDs to rent an apartment. Dale Morrison had found work as a construction laborer under an assumed name, while Jennifer had taken a job as a hotel housekeeper. More disturbing was Rebecca's discovery of their history with the foster care system. Over the past decade, the Morrisons had taken in over 20 children, always those classified as special needs or difficult to place because of the higher monthly payments these cases provided. 3 other children in their care had suffered suspicious injuries requiring hospitalization, but investigations had been cursory and no charges were ever filed. "They're predators," Rebecca told Luke during their phone call. "They specifically target vulnerable children who are less likely to be believed if they report abuse. The system failed these kids repeatedly." Luke shared this information with Ana, who paled as she read through Rebecca's findings. "I should have known," she whispered. "I should have done background checks on every family that took children for the money instead of love." "You can't blame yourself for a broken system," Luke said, though he understood her guilt intimately. "The question now is what we do with this information." Ana looked up at him with fierce determination. "We make sure they never hurt another child, and we make sure Tommy gets justice." That evening, Luke sat with Scout at Tommy's grave, sharing updates about the investigation. The dog seemed to understand more than should have been possible, his ears perking up at mentions of the Morrisons' names, his body growing tense when Luke described their pattern of abuse. "We're gonna get them," Luke promised, scratching behind Scout's ears. They thought they could hurt Tommy and just walk away, but they were wrong. Family doesn't forget, and family doesn't forgive something like this. Dr. Peterson stopped by with Scout's evening meal, noting the visible improvement in the dog's condition. "He's gained almost 3 pounds since you started visiting," the veterinarian observed. "Amazing what a little hope can do." "He's not the only one," Luke replied, realizing how true those words were. For the first time since David's death, Luke felt connected to something larger than his own success or failure. He had a purpose that went beyond profit margins and board meetings. That night, Luke called his attorney, Michael Chun, with an update. "I want to hire the best criminal lawyer in Nevada," he said. "Someone who can work with local authorities to reopen this case." "Luke," Michael said carefully, "you need to understand that even with this new evidence, building a murder case 8 months after the fact won't be easy. The crime scene has been compromised, witnesses have scattered, and proving intent will be challenging." "I don't care how challenging it is," Luke replied. "That little boy was family, and no one gets away with killing family." As the investigation expanded, Luke found himself spending more time in Cedar Falls, extending his hotel stay indefinitely. His business associates in San Francisco began questioning his prolonged absence, but for the first time in his career, Luke found he didn't care about quarterly projections or market share. The local community had embraced both him and Scout, with townspeople regularly stopping by the cemetery to check on the dog's welfare. Martha Hendricks had organized an informal support network, ensuring Scout never lacked for food or attention when Luke was away following leads. "You've changed this town," Mayor Jang told him during one of their conversations. "People are talking." about Tommy's story, about how the system failed him. There's talk of establishing new oversight procedures for foster placements. Luke nodded, but his mind was already working on something bigger. What if we could do more than just fix the local system? What if we could create a model for other communities? The idea that had been forming in his mind was ambitious. A foundation dedicated to reforming foster care oversight, ensuring that children like Tommy would never again slip through the cracks. It would require significant resources and political connections, but Luke had both thought as he walked back to the cemetery that evening. Luke felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since David's death. Tommy's tragic story was becoming a catalyst for change, transforming grief into action and ensuring that his nephew's short life would have lasting meaning. Scout was waiting for him, tail wagging at the sight of Luke's approach. The dog had learned to associate Luke's visits with progress in the investigation, and tonight Luke had particularly good news to share. Rebecca found them, he told Scout quietly. She knows exactly where the Morrisons are living, what names they're using, even where they work. Tomorrow we start the process of bringing them back to face justice. Scout's eyes seemed to gleam with understanding, and for the first time since Tommy's death, the dog lay down beside the grave without the rigid posture of a guardian on duty. He was still protecting Tommy's memory, but now he had help. Luke settled beside them both, his nephew's headstone reflecting the last rays of sunset. "We're going to make this right, Tommy," he whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed family, but I'm here now, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows your story." Rebecca's next report arrived 3 days later, and its contents made Luke's blood run cold. She had obtained the Morrisons' banking records through methods Luke chose not to question, and the financial trail revealed a pattern of exploitation that went far beyond what anyone had suspected. Over the past 5 years, the Morrisons had collected over $300,000 in foster care payments, disability supplements, and special needs allowances. But more damning was the paper trail showing how they'd systematically applied for the highest maintenance, children-available kids with behavioral issues, trauma histories, or medical needs that qualified for additional funding. They were running a business, Rebecca explained during their video call. Take in the most damaged kids, collect the maximum payments, provide minimal care, and move on when things got complicated. The banking records showed that within hours of Tommy's death, the Morrisons had liquidated their accounts and purchased money orders, a common method for hiding financial trails. They'd also made large cash withdrawals in the days leading up to Tommy's death, suggesting premeditation. They were planning to leave, Luke realized. They knew something was going to happen. "It gets worse," Rebecca continued. "I found medical records for 3 other children who were in their care over the past 2 years. All suffered injuries requiring emergency room visits, broken bones, concussions, severe bruising. Each time, the Morrisons claimed the children had fallen or hurt themselves during play." Luke felt sick. How many kids did they hurt? That we can prove? At least 6. But I suspect there were more who never reported their injuries or whose cases were covered up. Rebecca's voice was grim. "I've also discovered that they're not using the Morrison name in Las Vegas. They're living as Dale and Jennifer Walsh, and they've already applied to be foster parents in Nevada." The thought of the Morrisons gaining access to more vulnerable children made Luke's hands clench into fists. "We have to stop them. I'm working with a contact in the Nevada Department of Family Services to flag their application, but it's a delicate situation. We need solid evidence to make criminal charges stick, and right now everything we have is circumstantial." After ending the call, Luke drove to the cemetery, needing the clarity that somehow came from sitting beside Tommy's grave. Scout was waiting for him, as always, but today the dog seemed agitated, pacing back and forth beside the headstone. "What is it, boy?" Luke asked. settling onto the grass. Scout rarely left Tommy's immediate vicinity, but now he was moving toward a cluster of old oak trees about 20 yards away. Looking back at Luke Pectantl, wide-eyed curious, Luke followed. Scout led him to a weathered oak with low-hanging branches, the kind of tree a child might climb for solitude or simply to escape the world for a while. Hidden among the roots, partially covered by fallen leaves, was a small wooden box, the kind used for school art projects. Luke's heart raced as he carefully lifted the box. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from moisture, was another of Tommy's sketchbooks. But this one was different. The drawings were darker, more detailed, and accompanied by careful written observations. The first page showed the Morrison house with alarming accuracy, including a floor plan that marked dangerous areas. Steep. Stairs no light switch at bottom. Dale's room stay away when drinking. Closet where Scout gets locked up. Page after page documented a systematic pattern of abuse and neglect. Tommy had drawn himself cooking meals while the Morrisons watched television, cleaning house while they entertained friends, caring for Scout when they refused to buy dog food. The written notes were even more damning. Dates, times, and detailed descriptions of violent outbursts. One entry made Luke's vision blur with rage. May 15th, Dale hit me because Scout barked. Said, if the dog makes noise again, he'll take him to the pound. I have to keep Scout quiet no matter what. Another, dated just 3 days before Tommy's death. Jennifer said I'm costing them too much money. She wants to send Scout away and get a smaller kid who's easier to handle. I won't let them take Scout. He's all I have left. The final entry, written in Tommy's careful handwriting on the day he died. They're planning something. Heard them talking about how much money they'll save if I'm not here anymore. Dale said accidents happen all the time to foster kids, and nobody asks too many questions. I'm scared, but I can't let them hurt Scout. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds this and knows the truth. Luke's hand shook as he read his nephew's final words. Tommy had known he was in danger, had documented everything with the methodical precision of a child who understood that adults didn't always protect the innocent. He'd been 8 years old and entirely alone, with only his dog for comfort and protection. That Scout whined softly, as if he too remembered the significance of this hiding place. Luke realized that the dog had been trying to lead him here for weeks, but it had taken this long for Luke to understand what Scout was trying to communicate. You've been protecting his evidence all this time? Luke whispered, scratching Scout's ears. You knew someone would eventually come looking, didn't you? Luke immediately called Rebecca, then Michael Chun, then Ana Rodriguez. Within hours, the hidden sketchbook was in the hands of the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit, where an agent named Sarah Kim specialized in child exploitation cases. This changes everything, Agent Kim told Luke during their meeting at the Portland field office. We now have documented evidence of premeditation, systematic abuse, and what amounts to a confession of intent to harm, combined with the financial records and their flight from the jurisdiction. We have grounds for federal charges. What happens now? Luke asked. We coordinate with Nevada authorities to arrest the Morrisons on federal charges of child endangerment resulting in death, fraud, and conspiracy. They'll be extradited back to Oregon to face murder charges. Agent Kim's expression was grave. Mr. Harlan, I want you to know that your nephew's courage in documenting what was happening to him may help us prosecute not just his killers, but other cases involving foster care abuse across multiple states. That evening, Luke sat with Scout in their usual spot beside Tommy's grave, but tonight felt different. The dog was calmer, more relaxed, as if some burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He was so brave, Luke told Scout. 8 years old. And he was braver than most adults I know. He made sure the truth would come out, even if he couldn't be here to tell it himself. Scout nuzzled closer, and for the first time since Luke had discovered his relationship to Tommy, he felt something other than grief and rage. He felt pride in a nephew he'd never met but who had shown extraordinary courage in his final days. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Luke made a decision that would reshape the rest of his life. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant in San Francisco. "Jennifer, I need you to prepare a press release. I'm establishing a foundation dedicated to foster care reform and child protection. The initial funding will be $50 million from my personal assets." "Mr. Harlan, are you sure?" "That's a significant portion of your liquid wealth." "I'm sure," Luke interrupted. "And Jennifer, I'm relocating the foundation headquarters to Cedar Falls, Oregon. I won't be returning to San Francisco permanently." As he ended the call, Scout's tail wagged slowly, and Luke could swear he felt Tommy's approval in the evening breeze that rustled through the cemetery's ancient trees. Justice was coming, but more importantly, Tommy's story would ensure that other children would never face the same fate. The boy who had died alone and forgotten was about to become the catalyst for protecting thousands of vulnerable children across the country. His legacy would be measured not in the years he'd lost, but in the lives he would save through his uncle's determination to honor his memory. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, an elderly woman who lived across the street from the Morrison house, contacted Ana Rodriguez after seeing a news report about the reopened investigation into Tommy's death. "I've been losing sleep for months," Mrs. Hoffman told Ana over the phone. "I kept telling myself I was probably mistaken. But after seeing that poor dog on the news, I can't stay quiet anymore." Ana immediately arranged for Luke to meet with Mrs. Hoffman, and what the elderly woman revealed changed the entire trajectory of the case. She had installed a security camera system after a series of break-ins in her neighborhood, and the cameras had been recording continuously for over a year, including the night Tommy died. "I never thought to check the footage until now," Mrs. Hoffman explained, leading Luke and Ana to her living room where a computer displayed multiple camera angles of her property. "The police never asked, and I assumed they had everything they needed for their investigation." With trembling hands, Mrs. Hoffman accessed the recordings from the night of Tommy's death. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. when the first relevant footage began. Through the grainy night vision cameras, they could see the Morrison house across the street, its windows illuminated by harsh interior lighting. "There," Mrs. Hoffman pointed to the screen. "That's when I heard the shouting start." The audio was muffled by distance and the camera's limited microphone, but raised voices were clearly audible. More importantly, the visual evidence contradicted everything the Morrisons had told police. Instead of a quiet household where a boy had accidentally fallen downstairs while letting his dog outside, the footage showed a violent domestic disturbance. Shadows moved frantically behind the windows, and at one point, Dale Morrison could be seen dragging something or someone away from the front door. The timestamp showed this activity continuing for over 20 minutes, far too long for a simple accident response. They were staging the scene, Luke realized, his voice tight with anger. They had plenty of time to arrange everything to look like an accident. The most damning evidence came at 12:15 a.m., when Jennifer Morrison was clearly visible through the kitchen window, methodically cleaning what appeared to be blood from her hands and clothes. This was over an hour before the 911 call that reported Tommy's accidental fall. "My God," Ana whispered. They let him lie there for over an hour before calling for help. Mrs. Hoffman's expression was pained. "I should have called the police myself that night. I heard the commotion, but I thought it was just another one of their arguments. They fought so often, and that poor little boy was always caught in the middle." Luke placed a gentle hand on the elderly woman's shoulder. "You're calling now, and that's what matters. This footage will ensure Tommy gets justice." Agent Kim arrived from Portland within hours, accompanied by a federal prosecutor named David Walsh, who specialized in child homicide cases. The security footage was immediately secured as evidence, and technical experts were brought in to enhance both the video and audio quality. "This is exactly what we needed," Agent Kim told Luke after reviewing the footage. "We now have visual evidence of the Morrisons' deception, proof that they had time to stage the scene, and documentation of suspicious behavior that contradicts their story." "How soon can you arrest them?" Luke asked. "We're coordinating with Las Vegas Metro Police right now. The arrests should happen within 24 hours. That night, Luke returned to the cemetery with news for both Tommy and Scout. The dog seemed to sense the significance of the moment, sitting more alertly than usual as Luke shared the developments. "We have them," Luke said quietly, his hand resting on Tommy's headstone. "The evidence is overwhelming, and they're going to pay for what they did to you." Scout's tail wagged slowly, and he moved closer to Luke, accepting the comfort of human contact in a way he hadn't since Tommy's death. The dog's gradual healing mirrored Luke's own journey from isolation to connection, from running away from grief to embracing the responsibility that came with love. As Luke sat in the gathering darkness, his phone rang with a call from Rebecca. "Torres, they've been arrested," she said without preamble. "Both Dale and Jennifer Morrison are in custody in Las Vegas, and extradition proceedings are already underway." Luke felt a wave of relief so powerful it left him dizzy. "What are they being charged with?" "Murder in the first degree, child abuse resulting in death, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The federal charges alone carry potential life sentences." After ending the call, Luke shared the news with Scout, who seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in months, the dog laid down beside Tommy's grave, without the rigid posture of a sentinel on duty. The next morning brought a flood of media attention as news of the arrest spread. Luke found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as the story of the loyal dog, the murdered foster child, and the millionaire uncle who fought for justice captured national attention. But rather than retreat from the publicity, Luke decided to use it as a platform for the larger cause he was championing. He arranged a press conference in Cedar Falls, with Scout by his side and Tommy's grave visible in the background. "My nephew Tommy Matthews died because a system that was supposed to protect him instead delivered him to predators who saw him as nothing more than a source of income," Luke told the assembled reporters. But Tommy's story doesn't end with his death. His courage in documenting the abuse he suffered has given us the evidence needed to ensure his killers face justice. Luke went on to announce the establishment of the Tommy Matthews Foundation for foster care reform with an initial endowment of $50 million. The foundation would advocate for stronger background checks for foster families, mandatory, unscheduled home visits, and a national database to track families who had been removed from the foster care system. Every child deserves what Tommy never had: a family that loves them, protects them, and sees them as precious rather than profitable, Luke concluded. "We cannot bring Tommy back, but we can honor his memory by ensuring no other child suffers the same fate." After the press conference, Anna approached Luke with tears in her eyes. "I want to help," she said. "I want to be part of the foundation, part of making sure this never happens again." "I was hoping you'd say that," Luke replied. "I need someone who understands the system from the inside, someone who genuinely cares about these kids." As the weeks passed and the legal proceedings moved forward, Luke found himself permanently relocated to Cedar Falls. He purchased a house within walking distance of the cemetery so he could continue his daily visits with Scout, and he converted the local bank building into headquarters for the foundation. The Morrisons' trial was still months away, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. More victims had come forward, former foster children who had suffered abuse in their care, but had been too afraid or too damaged to speak out before. Tommy's hidden sketchbook had become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, with each drawing and written entry serving as testimony from beyond the grave. The boy who had died alone had found his voice through art, and that voice was demanding justice, not just for himself, but for every child who had suffered in silence. Scout's transformation was equally remarkable. Under Luke's care and with regular veterinary attention, the dog had regained his strength and spirit. While he still visited Tommy's grave daily, it was no longer with the desperate vigilance of those first weeks. Instead, he seemed to understand that his watch had ended successfully. Family had come, truth had been revealed, and justice was being served. As autumn settled over Cedar Falls, Luke stood with Scout beside Tommy's grave, watching the last leaves fall from the oak trees. In a few weeks, the Morrisons would stand trial for murder, and Tommy's story would be told in full to a jury that would decide their fate. But for Luke, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the knowledge that Tommy's death had sparked a movement that would protect countless other children. The boy who had been forgotten and abandoned had become a symbol of resilience and hope, proof that even the smallest voice could change the world when amplified by love and determination. 3 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Dr. Peterson made a discovery that would shake the foundation of everything Luke thought he knew about Tommy's final days. During a routine grooming session to prepare Scout for what would likely be his final visit to Tommy's grave before the trial proceedings began, the veterinarian noticed something unusual about the dog's collar. "This is odd," Dr. Peterson murmured, running his fingers along the thick leather band that Scout had worn since his puppy days. "There's something sewn into the leather itself. Feels like paper or fabric." Luke leaned closer as Dr. Peterson carefully examined the collar under a magnifying glass. "It's been stitched shut, but not with the original manufacturing. Someone added this later, very carefully." With Scout lying calmly on the examination table, Dr. Peterson used a seam ripper to carefully open the hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a small plastic bag and preserved against moisture and decay, was a folded piece of paper covered in Tommy's distinctive handwriting. Luke's hands trembled as he unfolded what appeared to be a letter, written in the careful, block letters of a child who had been taught that his words mattered. The date at the top showed it had been written on the morning of the day Tommy died. "Dear family," the letter began, "I don't know who you are or if you'll ever find this, but Scout knows how to keep secrets safe. If you're reading this, it probably means something bad happened to me, and I want you to know it wasn't an accident." Luke had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the direct communication from the nephew he'd never known. When he continued, Tommy's words painted a picture of a boy who had not only documented his abuse, but had actively planned for the possibility of his own death. "The Morrisons don't want me anymore. I heard Jennifer talking on the phone yesterday about how they need to solve the Tommy problem before their next inspection. She said kids like me have accidents all the time, and nobody investigates too. Hard because everyone just assumes foster kids are damaged goods." The letter went on to detail specific conversations Tommy had overheard, including Dale Morrison's plan to make his death look like a fall down the stairs. But the most shocking revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs. "I know who my real father was. I found papers in Jennifer's dresser when I was looking for Scout's vaccination records. My father's name was David Harlan, and he died in a car accident before I was born. My mother's name was Sarah Martinez, but she couldn't take care of me because she was sick." Luke's vision blurred as he read his nephew's words. Tommy had known about his connection to the Harlan family, had known he had an uncle somewhere who might have cared for him if only he could have been found. "The paper said my father had a brother named Luke who lived in California and was very successful. I used to imagine that maybe someday he would find me and we could be a family. I drew pictures of what I thought he might look like, and I practiced. what I would say if we ever met. The letter continued with heartbreaking hope. If something happens to me, I hope Luke will take care of Scout. He's the best dog in the world, and he's the only family I've ever really had. I taught him to find this letter by scratching behind his ears 3 times and saying, "Family secret." He'll show you where I hid my other drawings that prove what the Morrisons did to me and other kids. Luke realized that Scout had been trying to communicate this information for months, but it had taken this long for Luke to understand the dog's signals. Every time Scout had grown agitated at the cemetery, every time he'd led Luke toward the oak trees, he'd been trying to reveal Tommy's final message. The letter concluded with words that broke Luke's heart completely. "I wish I could have met my Uncle Luke and told him about my father. I have so many questions about David and what he was like. I know I would have loved him, and maybe he would have loved me too. Please tell Luke that I tried to be brave, like I think his brother would have wanted me to be. And please don't let the Morrisons hurt any other kids." Dr. Peterson handed Luke a tissue as he finished reading, his own eyes wet with tears. "That boy was extraordinary," he said quietly. "To have that kind of foresight and planning at 8 years old, it's remarkable." Luke carefully refolded the letter, understanding that it represented more than just evidence. It was Tommy's final gift to the uncle he'd dreamed of meeting. The boy had not only documented his own murder, but had reached across death itself to ensure that Scout would be cared for and that the truth would eventually be revealed. But there was more. Following Tommy's instructions, Luke scratched behind Scout's ears 3 times and said, "Family secret." The dog immediately stood up, tail wagging, and led them to the oak tree where Luke had discovered the hidden sketchbook. But this time, Scout pawed at a different spot, revealing a second hiding place that contained a waterproof container. Inside were more drawings, but these weren't just documentation of abuse. They were portraits of a family Tommy had never known but had desperately wanted to find. Using details from the papers he'd found, Tommy had drawn imagined scenes of his father David as a young man, his grandparents, and multiple versions of an uncle named Luke. One drawing showed a tall man in a business suit standing beside a small boy and a golden retriever, with "My Uncle Luke and me and Scout" written carefully at the bottom. Another depicted a family gathering around a Christmas tree, with Tommy positioned between his imagined uncle and a figure labeled "My Dad in Heaven." "He was planning to find you," Dr. Peterson realized, examining the drawings. "These aren't just fantasies. They're goals." He was documenting everything he could about his real family. The discovery of Tommy's letter transformed the prosecution's case from a murder trial into something much larger. The letter provided irrefutable proof of premeditation by the Morrisons, but it also revealed the depth of systemic failure that had kept a child separated from family who would have loved and protected him. Agent Kim immediately contacted Luke with the implications. "This letter changes the charges we can file. We now have evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, and Tommy's own words about overhearing their plans gives us the premeditation element we needed for first-degree murder charges." But for Luke, the legal implications were secondary to the personal revelation contained in Tommy's words. His nephew had known about him, had hoped for rescue, had dreamed of the family connection that Luke had unknowingly failed to provide. That evening, Luke sat with Scout beside Tommy's grave, the letter carefully preserved in a protective folder. "He knew about me," Luke said aloud, his voice breaking. "He was waiting for me to find him, and I never even looked." Scout moved closer, offering the comfort of his presence as Luke grappled with the magnitude of what had been lost. Tommy had died not just hoping for rescue, but actively planning for the moment when his uncle might finally discover his existence. The letter also revealed something else that changed Luke's understanding of Scout's vigil. The dog hadn't just been grieving, he'd been following Tommy's final instructions, waiting for the right person to arrive so he could reveal the hidden messages that would ensure justice. You knew all along, didn't you? Luke asked out. You were waiting for me specifically, because Tommy told you I would come eventually. Scout's response was to gently take Luke's hand in his mouth and lead him once more to the oak tree, but this time to show him something they'd missed before. Carved into the bark, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, were Tommy's initials intertwined with Scout's name and a single word: hope. Tommy had never stopped believing that family would find him, even as he prepared for the worst-case scenario. His final letter wasn't just evidence of murder. It was a testament to the power of hope and the belief that love could transcend even death itself. As Luke held the letter and watched Scout settle beside Tommy's grave, he understood that his nephew's greatest victory wasn't in documenting his murder. It was in ensuring that his uncle would finally understand what family truly meant, and in creating a bond between man and dog that would honor his memory for years to come. The discovery of Tommy's letter created a media firestorm that reached far beyond Cedar Falls. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the 8-year-old boy who had not only predicted his own murder, but had left behind evidence that would convict his killers. The letter's revelation that Tommy had known about his uncle and dreamed of being rescued added a layer of tragedy that captured the public's imagination and outrage. Luke found himself at the center of a national conversation about foster care, reform, child protection, and the failures of systems meant to safeguard society's most vulnerable members. He appeared on news programs, testified before congressional committees, and worked with lawmakers to draft legislation that would bear Tommy's name. But as the trial date approached, Luke struggled with a more personal challenge: the defense. Attorneys for the Morrisons had developed a strategy that attacked not just the evidence, but Tommy's credibility as a witness. They argued that the drawings and letter were the products of a disturbed child's imagination, that Tommy had been emotionally damaged by years in foster care and had fabricated abuse allegations. They're going to paint him as a liar, prosecutor David Walsh warned Luke during one of their preparation meetings. They'll claim that his attachment disorder made him prone to fantasy, and that his fear of abandonment led him to create elaborate stories to gain attention. Luke felt his anger rising. They're putting a dead child on trial. That's exactly what they're doing, Walsh agreed. And we need to be prepared to defend Tommy's character as vigorously as we're prosecuting his murder. The prosecution team had assembled a comprehensive case that went far beyond Tommy's letter and drawings. They had the security footage from Mrs. Hoffman's cameras, the financial records showing the Morrisons' pattern of exploiting foster children, testimony from medical professionals who had treated Tommy's previous injuries, and statements from former foster children who had suffered similar abuse. Anna Rodriguez had become a key witness. Her testimony about Tommy's intelligence and careful nature, crucial to establishing that his documented observations were reliable rather than fantastical. Dr. Peterson provided evidence about Scout's behavior and the sophisticated way Tommy had trained the dog to protect his hidden messages. But the most powerful element of the prosecution's case was Tommy himself. The letter, the drawings, and the methodical way he had documented abuse painted a picture of a child whose only disorder had been his desperate desire to survive and protect the one being who loved him unconditionally. Luke spent the days leading up to the trial in intensive preparation, reviewing every piece of evidence and working with victim advocates to ensure that Tommy's story was told with the dignity and respect he deserved. The Tommy Matthews Foundation had grown rapidly, with offices in 12 states and a team of investigators working to identify other foster care abuse cases. Scout had become an unexpected source of strength during this period. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the approaching trial, staying close to Luke during meetings and providing comfort during the most difficult moments of preparation. Dr. Peterson had certified Scout as a therapy animal, allowing him to accompany Luke to court proceedings. 3 days before the trial, Luke received an unexpected call from Rebecca Torres. "I found Sarah Martinez," she said without preamble. "She's alive, and she wants to talk to you." Luke's heart raced. Tommy's mother, the young woman whose fear and addiction had led to his nephew's abandonment, was alive and apparently willing to face the consequences of her actions. "Where is she?" Luke asked. "She's been clean for 2 years, living in a halfway house in Seattle. She saw the news coverage about Tommy's case and contacted me through the foundation's website." Rebecca's voice was careful. "Luke, she's devastated. She had no idea what happened to Tommy after she left him at the bus station. She thought he'd been adopted by a loving family." The meeting with Sarah Martinez took place in Seattle, with Rebecca and a counselor from the halfway house present. For support, Sarah was thin and worn, her face showing the ravages of addiction and grief. But her eyes held a clarity that spoke of genuine recovery and remorse. "I killed him," were her first words to Luke. "I left my baby at a bus station because I was too scared and too sick to take care of him. If I'd been braver, if I'd reached out to David's family like I should have, Tommy would still be alive." Luke studied the woman who had given birth to his nephew, seeing echoes of Tommy's features in her face. The same large eyes, the same delicate bone structure. "Tell me about David," he said quietly. "Tell me about Tommy as a baby." Sarah's composure cracked as she shared memories Luke had never known existed. She described David as gentle and artistic, someone who had talked about his older brother with admiration and love. She told Luke about Tommy's first steps, his first words, the way he had already shown signs of his father's creative talent by drawing recognizable shapes before his 2nd birthday. "David was so excited about the baby," Sarah whispered. "He had names picked out, had started saving money for college. He wanted to introduce me to his family, but I was too intimidated. I thought his parents would see me as some gold digger trying to trap their son." "They would have loved you both," Luke said, and meant it. "My parents spent years grieving David. They would have seen Tommy as a gift, a way to keep David's memory alive." Sarah broke down completely then, sobbing with a grief that had been compounded by years of guilt and self-hatred. "I was 18 and stupid and so afraid of everything. When David died, I thought my world had ended. I couldn't handle a baby on my own, couldn't handle anything. I started using drugs to numb the pain, and everything just spiraled." The conversation lasted 3 hours, with Sarah providing details about Tommy's early life that Luke treasured. Despite their painful context, she described a happy baby who loved music and animals, who had formed an immediate bond with Scout when she brought the puppy home as a companion for her son. "I thought if I left him somewhere safe, someone would adopt him and give him the life I couldn't," Sarah said. "I never imagined he'd end up in foster care, bouncing from home to home. I thought I was saving him by giving him up." Luke found himself comforting the woman whose actions had indirectly led to Tommy's death. He understood now that Sarah had been a victim to a teenage mother overwhelmed by grief and addiction, making desperate choices from a place of fear rather than malice. "Would you testify at the trial?" Luke asked as their meeting drew to a close. "Tommy deserves to have his mother speak for him." Sarah nodded through her tears. "I owe him that much. I owe him everything." The final preparation for the trial took place in Cedar Falls, with the prosecution team working from the Foundation's headquarters. Luke had decided that Scout should be present in the courtroom, believing that the dog's presence would honor Tommy's memory and remind everyone why they were fighting for justice. On the evening before the trial began, Luke and Scout made their traditional visit to Tommy's grave. The cemetery was peaceful in the fading light, and Luke felt a sense of readiness that had been building for months. "Tomorrow we tell your story," Luke said to the headstone. "Everyone will know what a brave, smart, loving boy you were. They'll know about your father and your dreams of finding family. And they'll know that the people who hurt you are going to pay for what they did." Scout settled beside the grave, but his posture was different from those first desperate weeks. He was calm, alert, ready for whatever came next. His vigil was ending, but his purpose had been fulfilled. Tommy's story would be told, justice would be served, and the family connection Tommy had dreamed of had finally been made as they walked back to the car. Luke's phone buzzed with messages from supporters around the country. The Tommy Matthews Foundation had received over $1 million in donations, and foster care reform legislation had been introduced in 15 states. Tommy's death was sparking changes that would protect thousands of other children. But more personally, Luke had found something he hadn't even known he was missing. In fighting for his nephew's memory, he had rediscovered his capacity for love and connection. He had built a new family with Scout, Anna, Dr. Peterson, and a community of Cedar Falls that had embraced Tommy's story as their own. The trial would determine whether the Morrisons spent the rest of their lives in prison. But for Luke, the real victory had already been won. Tommy was no longer a forgotten foster child who had died alone. He was a beloved nephew whose courage and hope had changed the world, one heart at a time. As Luke drove home with Scout beside him, he felt Tommy's presence in a way that went beyond grief or memory. His nephew lived on in every child who would be protected by the reforms his death had inspired, in every foster family who would be more carefully screened, in every social worker who would remember Tommy's story and fight harder for the children. In their care, tomorrow would bring justice, but tonight brought peace, the knowledge that love could indeed transcend death, and that even the briefest life could have infinite meaning when it touched the right hearts at the right moment. In time, the courthouse in Portland was surrounded by media vans and protesters on the morning the Morrison trial began. Luke arrived early with Scout, both of them walking through a crowd of supporters holding signs demanding justice for Tommy. The case had captured national attention, with child welfare advocates, foster care survivors, and ordinary citizens following every development. Inside the courthouse, Luke took his seat in the gallery reserved for family members, with Scout lying quietly at his feet. The dog wore a small vest identifying him as a therapy animal, and his presence drew gentle smiles from court officers who had followed his story in the news. Dale and Jennifer Morrison entered the courtroom in shackles, their appearance dramatically changed from the confident foster parents they had once pretended to be. Dale had lost weight in jail and carried himself with the defeated posture of a man who knew his fate was sealed. Jennifer avoided all eye contact, staring at the table in front of her with the blank expression of someone trying to disconnect from reality. Their defense attorneys had fought unsuccessfully to exclude Tommy's letter and drawings from evidence, arguing that the statements of a deceased child constituted hearsay. But Judge Patricia Moreau had ruled that Tommy's documented observations qualified as dying declaration statements made by a victim who believed death was imminent, which carried special weight in criminal proceedings. Prosecutor David Walsh opened with a statement that laid out the prosecution's case in devastating detail. He described Tommy as a bright, careful child who had survived years in foster care through intelligence and resilience, only to be placed with people who saw him as nothing more than a source of income. Tommy Matthews was 8 years old when Dale and Jennifer Morrison killed him, Walsh told the jury. But he didn't die without a fight. Using the skills of observation and documentation that had helped him survive 17 different foster placements, Tommy recorded everything: the abuse, the threats, the conversations he overheard about plans to end his life. Walsh held up Tommy's hidden letter, protected now in a clear evidence sleeve. This letter, sewn into his dog's collar as insurance against his own murder, shows us the mind of a child who understood he was in mortal danger but refused to give up hope that his real family would eventually find him. The defense opened with exactly the strategy Luke had expected, painting Tommy as a disturbed child whose documented observations couldn't be trusted. Defense attorney Margaret Collins argued that years of trauma had left Tommy unable to distinguish between reality and fantasy. This was a troubled little boy who had been rejected by 17 families, Collins told the jury. A child who was so desperate for attention and connection that he created elaborate stories of abuse and conspiracy. His death, while tragic, was exactly what the evidence shows: an accident that occurred when he fell down a steep staircase in the dark. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. The security footage from Mrs. Hoffman's cameras was played for the jury, showing the violent disturbance in the Morrison house and the hour-long delay before emergency services were called. Medical experts testified that Tommy's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall, particularly the defensive wounds on his hands and arms. Ana Rodriguez took the stand on the second day, her testimony providing crucial context about Tommy's intelligence and reliability as an observer. She described his careful nature, his artistic talent, and his deep bond with Scout. Tommy was one of the most perceptive children I ever worked with, Ana told the jury. He had learned to read adult behavior as a survival skill. His observations about the families he lived with were always accurate, sometimes uncomfortably so. Under cross-examination, Collins tried to paint Ana as someone who had failed Tommy by placing him with the Morrisons despite warning signs. But Ana's genuine remorse and her detailed knowledge of Tommy's case history only reinforced her credibility. Dr. Peterson testified about Scout's behavior and the sophisticated way Tommy had trained the dog to protect his hidden messages. This wasn't the work of a confused or fantastical child, the veterinarian explained. Tommy understood that he might not survive to tell his own story, so he created a backup plan using the only family member he had, his dog. The most powerful testimony came from Sarah Martinez, Tommy's mother, who had flown in from Seattle to face the consequences of her actions. Prosecutor Walsh handled her testimony carefully, acknowledging her role in Tommy's abandonment while emphasizing that her actions, however misguided, hadn't included murder. "I failed my son in every way possible," Sarah said through tears, "but I never wanted him hurt. I thought I was giving him a chance at a better life with a real family. If I had known what foster care would be like for him, I would have kept him and lived on the street before letting strangers take him." Collins tried to use Sarah's testimony to shift blame away from her clients, arguing that Tommy's problems stemmed from his abandonment rather than abuse by the Morrisons. But Sarah's detailed descriptions of Tommy as a happy, loving baby only highlighted how much promise had been destroyed by the defendant's actions. The prosecution's case built methodically through expert testimony, financial records, and witness statements. Former foster children who had survived the Morrison household testified about systematic abuse and the couple's focus on collecting maximum payments while providing minimal care. But it was Tommy's own voice that proved most compelling. As Walsh read excerpts from the hidden letter aloud in court, several jurors were visibly moved by the 8-year-old's courage and hope. "I wish I could have met my Uncle Luke and told him about my father," Walsh read in Tommy's words. "I have so many questions about David and what he was like. I know I would have loved him, and maybe he would have loved me too." Luke felt tears streaming down his face as his nephew's words filled the courtroom. Beside him, Scout whined softly, as if he too remembered the boy who had written those words with such desperate hope. The first week of testimony established the prosecution's narrative beyond reasonable doubt. Tommy had been murdered by people who saw him as a financial burden and had planned his death to look like an accident. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive clear, and the victim's own words provided testimony that no cross-examination could undermine. As court recessed for the weekend, Luke felt confident that justice would be served. But he also felt the weight of what was being revealed, not just the details of Tommy's murder, but the systematic failures that had made it possible. Walking out of the courthouse with Scout, Luke was approached by a reporter who asked how he felt about the trial's progress. "Tommy is finally getting his day in court," Luke replied. "His voice is being heard, his story is being told, and everyone now knows what a remarkable boy he was. That's what matters most." The second week of the trial brought the defense's case, and Margaret Collins made every effort to create reasonable doubt about her client's guilt. She called character witnesses who described the Morrisons as dedicated foster parents, who had taken in difficult children out of compassion rather than greed. But under cross-examination, these witnesses revealed they had known the Morrisons only superficially and had never spent extended time in their home. More damaging was the testimony of Dr. Raymond Pierce, a child psychologist hired by the defense to analyze Tommy's mental state. Dr. Pierce argued that Tommy's documented observations were products of hypervigilance and paranoid ideation caused by repeated trauma and abandonment. He suggested that Tommy had created elaborate persecution fantasies as a way of coping with his fear of being rejected again. Prosecutor Walsh's cross-examination of Dr. Pierce was devastating. "Doctor, you never met Tommy Matthews, did you?" "No, but I reviewed his psychological evaluations." Evaluations that described him as highly intelligent, observant, and reality-oriented. "Well, yes, but did you review the security footage showing the violent disturbance in the Morrison home on the night Tommy died?" "I did, but video evidence doesn't necessarily support the interpretation." "Doctor, in your professional opinion, would a child suffering from paranoid delusions be capable of the careful planning and execution required to hide evidence in multiple locations, train a dog to protect that evidence, and write a coherent letter predicting his own murder?" Dr. Pierce's credibility crumbled under Walsh's questioning, particularly when he admitted he had been paid $50,000 for his testimony and had never worked with foster children or abuse cases. The defense's case collapsed completely when Collins called Jennifer Morrison to testify in her own defense. Against her attorney's advice, Jennifer insisted on taking the stand, believing she could convince the jury that Tommy's death had been a tragic accident. Under direct examination, Jennifer painted herself as a caring foster mother overwhelmed by Tommy's behavioral problems. She claimed that Tommy had been increasingly aggressive and threatening, that he had talked about hurting himself and Scout, and that his fall down the stairs had occurred during one of his episodes. But Walsh's cross-examination exposed the lies in devastating detail. Using the financial records Rebecca Torres had uncovered, he showed that the Morrisons had specifically requested high-maintenance children because of the additional payments involved. "Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you and your husband collected over $300,000 in foster care payments over the past 5 years? We deserved that money. Taking care of damaged kids is expensive." "Damaged kids? Is that how you saw Tommy?" Jennifer's mask slipped completely. "These kids come to you already broken. We were doing society a favor by taking them off the streets." Walsh pressed harder. "You testified that Tommy threatened to hurt Scout, but the evidence shows that Tommy loved that dog more than anything in the world. Isn't it true that you threatened to take Scout away if Tommy didn't behave?" "The dog was a nuisance. Always underfoot, always needing attention. Mrs. Morrison, on the night Tommy died, why was Scout locked in a closet if Tommy had supposedly let him outside?" Jennifer's composure cracked. "I don't remember. Everything happened so fast. You don't remember locking the only witness to your crime in a closet while you staged Tommy's death to look like an accident. That's not what happened." Jennifer shouted. "He fell down the stairs. It was an accident." But Walsh had the security footage queued up on the courtroom monitor. "Mrs. Morrison, this video shows you and your husband moving around the house for over an hour before calling 911. What were you doing during that time if Tommy had simply fallen down the stairs?" Jennifer's testimony became increasingly incoherent as Walsh systematically demolished her story. She contradicted herself repeatedly, admitted to lies she had told investigators, and revealed a callous attitude toward Tommy that shocked even her own attorney. The prosecution's rebuttal case was brief but powerful. Walsh called Luke to the stand to establish the family connection and to read portions of Tommy's letter that revealed the boy's knowledge of his heritage. "Mr. Harlan, when you read Tommy's letter describing his hope that his Uncle Luke would find him, how did that make you feel?" Luke's voice broke as he answered, "It made me realize that while I was building walls around my heart after losing my brother, my nephew was building bridges, hoping someone would eventually cross them to reach him." Dale Morrison's attorney chose not to have his client testify, recognizing that anything Dale said would only make their situation worse. The defense rested without presenting any credible alternative theory for Tommy's death. Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with the courtroom packed with spectators who had followed the case. Walsh's summation was a masterpiece of logical precision and emotional appeal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a little boy who refused to be silenced, even by death itself. Tommy Matthews documented his own murder because he understood that dead children can't testify against their killers unless they plan ahead." Walsh methodically reviewed the evidence, the financial motive, the security footage, the medical evidence, Tommy's documented observations, and the defendant's own contradictory statements. The defense wants you to believe that Tommy was a disturbed child whose observations can't be trusted. But the evidence shows us a boy of extraordinary courage and intelligence who understood his situation with heartbreaking clarity. Collins's closing argument was a desperate attempt to create doubt where none existed. She argued that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and the unreliable statements of a traumatized child, but her words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence the prosecution had presented. When she suggested that Tommy's death might have been suicide rather than murder, several jurors visibly recoiled at the suggestion that an 8-year-old would kill himself by throwing himself downstairs. Judge Moreau's instructions to the jury were clear and comprehensive. She explained the legal standards for first-degree murder, the concept of dying declarations, and a weight to be given to circumstantial evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the foreman's voice was steady and clear. "On the charge of murder in the first degree against Dale Morrison, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree against Jennifer Morrison, we find the defendant guilty." The guilty verdicts continued through all charges: child abuse resulting in death, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Both defendants would face life sentences without the possibility of parole. As the verdicts were read, Luke felt Scout's head rest against his leg. The dog seemed to understand that their long journey toward justice had finally reached its destination. Tommy's killers would spend the rest of their lives in prison, and his story would serve as a warning to others who might see vulnerable children as opportunities for exploitation. Outside the courthouse, Luke spoke to the assembled media with Scout by his side. "Today, Tommy Matthews got the justice he deserved," he said. "But more importantly, his courage in documenting what happened to him has given voice to thousands of other children who suffer in silence. His legacy will be measured not in the years he lost, but in the lives he saves through the reforms his death has inspired." The trial was over, but Tommy's impact on the world was just beginning. His story had sparked a national conversation about foster care reform, and the Tommy Matthews Foundation was working with lawmakers across the country to implement stronger protections for vulnerable children. As Luke and Scout drove back to Cedar Falls that evening, both of them seemed lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and Tommy's voice would continue to speak for children who needed protection and love. 6 months after the trial ended, Luke stood before a crowd of over 300 people gathered in Hillcrest Cemetery for the dedication of the Tommy Matthews Memorial Garden. The space had been transformed from a simple cemetery into a place of beauty and reflection, with winding paths, flowering trees, and benches where visitors could sit quietly and remember loved ones. At the center of the garden stood a bronze statue of a boy and his dog, their faces turned toward the sky with expressions of hope and determination. The inscription on the base read, "Thomas, Tommy Matthews, and Scout. Their loyalty teaches us that love transcends death, and courage can change the world." Scout, now healthy and vibrant, had served as the model for his bronze counterpart. He sat beside Luke during the ceremony, wearing a special collar that Luke had commissioned, one decorated with small bronze plates bearing the names of children whose lives had been saved through the Foundation's work. Ana Rodriguez, now the executive director of the Tommy Matthews Foundation, spoke about the changes that have been implemented across the country in Tommy's name. Mandatory unscheduled home visits, enhanced background screening, and a national database to track problematic foster families had become standard practice in 23 states. Tommy believed that family would eventually find him, Ana told the assembled crowd. He was right, not just his Uncle Luke, but a family of advocates, social workers, and ordinary citizens who refused to let vulnerable children suffer in silence. Dr. Peterson had brought several of the therapy dogs trained through the Foundation's program, including 2 of Scout's own puppies, who were now working with traumatized children in Oregon and Washington. The sight of these golden retrievers, so clearly Scout's offspring, brought tears to many eyes as people remembered the loyal dog who had refused to abandon his boy. Sarah Martinez attended the ceremony, now 2.5 years clean and working as a counselor for young mothers struggling with addiction. She had found peace through her work with the Foundation, helping other women avoid the mistakes that had cost her son his life. "I can't bring Tommy back," Sarah said during her brief remarks, "but I can honor his memory by making sure other mothers get the support I never had." Tommy's story shows us that it's never too late to choose love over fear. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial plaque that would ensure Tommy's story was preserved for future generations. Luke read the inscription aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering, in memory of Thomas David Matthews, age 8, whose courage in the face of evil sparked a movement to protect vulnerable children everywhere. Though his life was brief, his impact is eternal. He taught us that even the smallest voice can change the world when amplified by love and justice. As the crowd began to disperse, Luke remained behind with Scout, sitting on the bench that had been placed directly beside Tommy's grave. The memorial garden had transformed the cemetery from a place of endings into a space of new beginnings, where Tommy's story continued to inspire visitors from around the world. Luke had made other changes to honor his nephew's memory. He had legally changed his own middle name to Thomas, wanting to carry part of his nephew with him always. He had also established a scholarship fund at the local high school for students aging out of foster care, ensuring that young people like Tommy would have opportunities for education and success. The Foundation had grown beyond anything Luke had initially imagined. With offices in 35 states and partnerships with child welfare organizations worldwide, it had become a powerful force for systemic change. The Tommy Matthews Protection Act had been signed into federal law, creating national standards for foster care oversight and establishing harsh penalties for those who exploited vulnerable children. Scout had played a crucial role in the Foundation's work, serving not just as a therapy dog, but as a living symbol of the loyalty and love that had defined his relationship with Tommy. Children who had suffered trauma found comfort in Scout's gentle presence, and his story helped them understand that healing was possible even after devastating loss. As the sun began to set over Cedar Falls, Luke felt a profound sense of completion. Tommy's vigil was over. His story had been told, and his killers were spending their lives in prison. More importantly, his nephew's courage had sparked changes that would protect countless other children from similar fates. "He did it, Scout," Luke said softly, his hand resting on the dog's head. "Tommy saved more kids than we'll ever know. He turned his tragedy into triumph, and he brought us together as a family." Scout's tail wagged slowly, and he moved closer to Luke, offering the comfort of his presence. The dog was older now, his muzzle showing gray, but his spirit remained strong. He had fulfilled his promise to Tommy, keeping the boy's secret safe until the right person arrived to understand their significance. Luke pulled out his phone and scrolled through recent messages from Foundation staff around the country. A foster family in Texas had been removed from the system after an unscheduled visit revealed abuse. A social worker in Florida had successfully reunited a child with relatives after using the Foundation's family search protocols. A teenager in California had received a scholarship to attend college, becoming the first in her family to pursue higher education. Each success story was a testament to Tommy's legacy, proof that his death had not been in vain. The boy who had died alone and forgotten had become a guardian angel for thousands of children, who would now receive the protection and love he had been denied. As darkness fell over the memorial garden, Luke and Scout made their way back to the car. Their daily visits to Tommy's grave would continue, but the desperate vigil of those early weeks had evolved into something more peaceful, a celebration of love, memory, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us across the boundaries of life and death. Luke had found his purpose in honoring his nephew's memory, and Scout had found peace in knowing that his loyalty had ultimately served its purpose. Together, they had ensured that Tommy Matthews would never be forgotten, and that his brief but extraordinary life would continue to make the world a safer place for vulnerable children. Everywhere. The golden retriever who had refused to leave. A boy's grave had taught them all about the power of unwavering devotion. Tommy's story had shown them that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could survive and love could triumph. And Luke had learned that family wasn't just about blood. It was about showing up for those who needed you most, even when that call came from beyond the grave. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Luke reflected on how completely his life had changed. He had come to this small town as a successful but emotionally isolated businessman, planning to build a resort that would erase his painful memories. Instead, he had discovered a nephew he'd never known existed, found a four-legged companion who would become his closest friend, and built a legacy that would outlast any corporate achievement. Tommy's story had taught Luke that success wasn't measured in profit margins or stock prices, but in the lives you touched and the love you shared. The boy who had died hoping for family had ultimately created a family larger than he could have ever imagined. A community of advocates, survivors, and ordinary people united in their commitment to protecting children. Scout settled into the passenger seat with a contented sigh, his vigil finally complete. He had kept faith with a boy who had trusted him with the most important secrets, and that faith had been rewarded with justice, love, and the knowledge that Tommy's story would continue to save lives for generations to come. In the distance, the lights of the memorial garden glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of hope for all who believed that love could transcend death and that even the smallest voice could change the world. Tommy Matthews had found his family at last, and his legacy would endure forever.